Morena, good morning and welcome back to those who regularly join Westpac Smarts, and a warm welcome to those who are tuning in for the first time. I'm Warrick Gibbs, Head of Construction, Transport and Forestry for Westpac. Today I'm thrilled to be joined by three expert panellists to share their knowledge and their experiences with you navigating today's topic, building houses in New Zealand, simpler, better and faster. Today's session is scheduled for 45 minutes and we'll take the first 30 minutes for the discussion with the panel, just leaving ourselves plenty of time for Q&A at the end. And if you've attended our webinar before, you'll be well familiar on how to register a question for our panel. However, if you're the first time joining, you'll see that there's a Q&A that's running on the right-hand side of your screen. So register your questions as they come to mind, please, and indicate the panelist which you would like the question to be directed to. It's very much like Facebook, so if you like a question raised by someone else, you'll not only make that person feel really popular by clicking on it, but you'll increase its rating, and we'll work through those that have the highest rating questions first. So let's kick off by introducing our panelists, and I'll ask each panelist to introduce themselves. If we start with Julien and then head on to Andrew and then Paul.
Good morning, everyone. Julien Leys, so I'm the CEO of the building industry Fed. I guess what we do is we're an advocate for the building supply chain. My background is as a lawyer specialising in public law, which then took me to Wellington. I was an advisor in government, and following that I've been a advocate lobbyist for 20 plus years.
Thanks, Julien. Over to you, Andrew.
Hi, Andrew Crosby. I'm CEO of Universal Homes. So we're building in the vicinity of 200 to 400 homes a year, probably on the lighter side this year. And a lot of half our business is really involved with sites with Kāinga Ora and up in Mildale, and the other half of our business is a large 1,500 home development in Westgate. I'm also a founding member of the Urban Development Institute of New Zealand, and teaching a Unitech course this weekend, so busy.
Welcome, and great to have you on the panel. Thanks, Andrew. And lastly, but not least, fellow colleague of mine, Paul Clark.
Yes, good morning, everybody. My name is Paul Clark. I'm the industrial economist at Westpac. Slightly different to your normal bank economists. I tend to focus on industry, very much micro-based. I look at how firms in different industries compete, and it could be any industry really. In this case, it's the residential building sector, and I was the author of the paper that we formed the basis of this discussion.
Welcome to you all. I know you all well, so I sort of feel like we're quite familiar with each other, so the conversation will flow quite nicely. As Paul mentioned, the focus of our discussion today is going to be centred around the Westpac construction paper. But before we kick off, I'd just like to acknowledge the impact recent flooding in Auckland and the severe impacts of Cyclone Gabrielle have had on whānau, people's homes and their businesses, particularly in Gisborne and the Hawke's Bay. This is New Zealand's third largest ever recorded state of emergency. And I'm sure you'll agree it's been impressive to see how Kiwis have rallied around to support these communities, and it makes you feel really proud to be a Kiwi. However, these disasters like this have proven to create some opportunities for some industries. And I'd like to open our panel discussion to get your views on how the effects of the storm and the cyclone may impact the construction sector. We've already seen a slowdown in the sector represented by consents dropping by 7% during November and December of last year. So Julien, can we start with you? How do you see the effects of these cyclones and the storms impacting the construction sector?
Yeah, look, as severe as it's been, I think the recovery is going to be focused primarily on infrastructure and civil works, so roads, bridges, the critical infrastructure, electricity, water treatment plants. the number of red sticker homes is currently in the sort of hundreds. We don't yet know what the full impact is going to be until the full assessment is made. But if we are comparing it, say, for example, to Christchurch, I don't think we'll be anywhere near that same level of red sticker homes, which I think was around 30,000. Nonetheless, I think the emphasis will be a lot on renovating homes, repairing homes. So that's going to mean a lot of things like carpets, gibboard, a lot of building materials, particularly from our members, to get those homes back up to scratch. But then I think actually the biggest challenge will be finding the tradies and the builders actually able to do the work, and more particularly who can relocate.
I think that's some really great points there, Julien. I think around the redirecting of resources. I know and have heard of many businesses and individuals taking volunteer leave and redirecting themselves down to the Hawke's Bay and Gisborne so far. So some great signs. Andrew, across to you. How do you view it?
I think in Auckland, and I'm right in the thick of it at the moment, a lot of the red stickers and yellow stickers are precautionary or only affect part of a house. And those houses that are affected, especially landslides, nothing's happening for a long time. Very complicated situation to deal with. So I just don't see much of a infusion of that work into the construction sector in Auckland. Certainly a lot of civil works, as Julien said. And considering the number of consents that I'm expecting to drop, I don't think it'll make a massive difference. Hawke's Bay and Gisborne and Wairoa, different story. I mean, I don't know what the situation is. Is it 1,000 homes? Is it 3,000 or 4,000 homes? Certainly down in that area, they won't be able to cope. So that's going to take a bit of a national effort. It's early days, though. People are just trying to dig out silt and assess what the problem is. So I think we've got a couple of months before we sort of know.
Great, thanks, Andrew. And Paul, just your views for a minute, if I may.
Yeah, I think the first thing to note is that, the cyclone, when you look at the area that it covered, it's really covering about 60% of New Zealand's population. So it's quite a big coverage. And those regions account for about 50% of New Zealand's GDP. So it's going to have a big impact. And I think we've seen some really initial, very early numbers from the Minister of Finance. I think it was something around 13 billion. The details there are a bit scratchy in terms of the cost, but they're going to be near-term effects for things like inflation, of course. Business activity is going to be disrupted, and some sectors are likely to be impacted more than others. In terms of construction, I would reiterate what the other panelists have said. We expect construction activity. Obviously, there is a pipeline already for res and non-res. And we expect that probably to extend further. There will be a reprioritisation of those works as well, and be interested to see that going forward. The key issue there, of course, is the constraints that are facing the industry already. It's already constrained, and those constraints will actually force that reprioritisation.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks, Julien and Andrew. I think there are some opportunities there for businesses, in particular in those areas of perhaps supporting from outside coming in. As we've already seen, there's been some amazing support rallied around the communities, including that from Westpac. And to help our small business owners with that recovery efforts, Westpac did launch a $1 million fund, which has been fully subscribed to for our small business customers through these events. And Westpac customers who meet the criteria can apply for $2,500 cash grant to help with their urgent expenses and repairs. Approval, of course, is at the discretion of Westpac. As at this morning, we've received 683 applications for the fund, and we've paid out 206 of those applications so far, hopefully helping to ease a small amount of stress for those impacted. And due to that high response, it's pleasing to hear that Westpac have now extended the non-repayable grants by an additional $3 million to also include agribusiness customers. And they're also donating $1 million to community, iwi, and the Merrill Relief Funds. So well done to Westpac. Now, if we can now divert our attention to the construction paper, Paul, your paper refers to being financially fit, structurally fit, and you address concepts like digitisation and industrialisation. Paul, can you explain for me, please, what do you mean by financially fit?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's got a lot of those kind of catch terms, hasn't it? But I suppose in simple terms, financially fit is being in really shorthand for getting your financial books in order. And to be fair, most firms should be doing that. I mean, this is kind of business as usual stuff. And what that really means, if we break it down, it's you've got to have a good handle on your finances. You've got to know what's going in, what's going out. And you've got to know the characteristics of those going ins and going outs. And that's very much a temporal thing. I think when activity slows, I think that becomes obviously a bigger issue. I think there's a initial focus on minimizing cost, and usually that means firms start to lay off staff. That's usually the first port of call, but it's not the only. I mean, there's other, and the paper talks about this in a lot more detail. Talks about eliminating profit leaks that every firm has, and getting rid of poorly performing profit centers. I think you also, the report talks about being financially fit in terms of revenues, and really it talks about how do you basically boost your revenues when work's drying up. And I think the paper talks about you look at projects, you focus on projects that may be less sensitive to the economic cycle or the boom and bust cycle that the industry finds itself in, or is a characteristic of. But focusing on different types of works that are funded, let's say publicly funded works, so it's less cyclical. And I think we also talk in the report about looking at supplementary services. Obviously, it's only those services where you might have a competency, and so you may have an operator or a builder that might have plumbing skills or electrician skills, might be registered, get involved in that kind of thing. So diversify your base. So that's really what we mean about being financially fit. And I'm sure there's many examples out there that could be shared. But a firm should be doing this anyway, and they should be doing this now in preparation for a slowdown.
Thanks, Paul. I think if I remember rightly, your paper refers to cash is king. I love you coining that phrase. And of course, the financial fitness businesses have their advisors right by their side, which are sometimes not readily used. And those include your banks, your advisors such as your accountant and your lawyers, and sometimes your mentors. So I just urge companies to reach out should they need it. Andrew, coming to you as CEO of a business, you're faced with those hard realities of changes in your operating model. What is it your take on financially fit?
Well, my CFO will attest that she's done a cash flow forecast, a 5-year cash flow forecast about every 2 weeks last year, of which Westpac have seen a few of them. And it's all about what are we going to start, when are we going to finish, what revenue can we expect, what's the good case, bad case, worst case type scenario. And we are, all property developers and builders are entering a worst case scenario. Construction costs going through the roof and still rising, going at 5% per annum and still going through the roof. Revenues dropping like a stone. And a lot of people in a situation where just at the peak, they over leveraged and bought as much land as possible. Ironically, for Universal, we were so useless at buying land during the boom because of our approval processes that we didn't actually buy much new stuff. So we're quite fortunate in that respect. The other side of it is property developers and builders should have made a lot of money in the last 2-3 years. So they should have reserves there. I do feel for those who've over leveraged and signed up for a lot of sections. But a lot of us really have got a lot of cash reserves there, which we're slowly spending. So financially fit is you just got to find it. You just got to do your cash flows, forecast. And for those smaller players who don't have as significant reporting as we do, you just got to talk to your bank. You got to let your bank know exactly where you are at all point in time. Don't hide from the fact. That's probably one of the biggest things of being financially fit, because the bank doesn't want you to fail. So
100%, Andrew, and I of course didn't know how you were going to respond, but I couldn't have asked you to respond any better. The 5-year planning, I have seen that in action, and it certainly is robust, and it enables you to keep a really good close eye on escalating costs and making sure that you're achieving those revenue expectations and margins that you've communicated to shareholders. So great to hear. Julien, I'm going to come over to you now. And given your role as industry representative, does this idea of being financially fit chime with you? What else should businesses be doing to make sure that they're able to get through the coming downturn?
Yeah, look, I'll echo certainly what Paul and Andrew have said, but also I think managing debtors is crucial in this time as well. It's actually making sure that people get paid on time. There's a tendency for a creep to start occurring, to only pay invoices 30 days, goes to 60 days. That has a big impact on small businesses particularly. I also think not overextending yourself on projects and work is also going to be especially important. There's a tendency to grab as much work as you can. I think now's probably more a time of focusing on the quality projects and ensuring you've got good clients who pay on time. There are people that are delaying work as well, just as a matter of caution, just kicking the can down the road a bit, again, to offset any financial exposure. The other one that I think from a building products point of view is I'm starting to hear from a number of builders, people are looking for better deals on materials and the cost of product prices. As Andrew said, the cost of construction has gone up, and that's not just labour, that's materials as well. So people are looking at, can they join a cooperative or a consortium? Can they pull their resources together where they can actually get a better deal on those materials, which does have an impact on price. New work is becoming much harder to find. I was talking to a builder in Christchurch who has got a crew of 45, and they build around about 8 homes a year. They've got one project that finishes in April, and after that there's nothing else. So I think it is about now starting to sort of think more clearly around what is your market in terms of building, and how do you get a little bit more savvy about finding that additional work. For example, Kangora, they are the biggest home builder by far in the country. They contract most of their work out. I know there are some builders knocking on their door to see if there's additional work. So, yeah, and then look, lastly, I'd just say, even though we are going into a recession and a downturn, it ironically is a time when there are opportunities. So, for example, this might be a time for businesses to consolidate. If people have cash reserves, as many of them do, as Andrew said, maybe it's a time to merge and scale up with smaller businesses. And then when the market bounces back, you're in a stronger position. So, yeah.
Thanks, Julien. I really like that last piece that you were talking about, and I have seen it in action just recently where businesses are collaborating for work, in particular where things are slowing down in their region, working with another firm to pick up work or to shift resources across to keep people employed. So that begs another question. Financially Fit's all about survival and it's all about getting through the downturn, but that doesn't really set you up for long-term sustainable growth. The paper, Paul, it then goes into say, to achieve this type of growth, firms need to embrace structural change to address many of the issues that impact the sector, such as cost and time overruns. Paul, you coined the phrase in the paper being structurally fit. What exactly does that mean?
Yeah, I think I've got a lot of phrases in this paper. I suppose in a theoretical sense, and it's really about changing how homes are built in New Zealand, and it talks about Yeah, so it's about how homes are built, and almost like the use of digital technologies, not just to digitize processes, which is just making processes more efficient, but actually using digital technologies to upend existing business models. And that's really what structural fit actually refers to. So I've got a slide here, so if I could put it up. Could I put that slide up? Okay, is it there? Yeah, it's there. So if we could press the enter button, I called this industrialization, and it just basically defines what I mean. So this, to me, is really what a traditional construction kind of pipeline or kind of looks like. A set of processes. You've got your planning, design, you go through consenting, go through land development, and then everything happens on site building, and there may be some argument over that. But generally, at a very crude level, that's kind of the way it's done. The kind of way I kind of look at this, and again, it's a conceptual model, it's theoretical, is if we press enter again, and into that thread, we move to this kind of industrialized kind of building, which kind of changes and makes things a little bit quicker. But a lot of it's got to do with using new digital technologies and pushing what traditionally has taken place on the building side, moving it back upstream and redefining those relationships along the supply chain. And that's in theory the way it should, the way I kind of envisage it. There's likely to be some disagreement over that, but in theory that's the way I see it, and it very much follows the manufacturization of the building process. So you end up with a lot of stuff being manufactured by what I've referred to in the paper as these manufacturing ecosystems, who then basically supply components and substructures, however you define different levels of beneficiation, to an assembler who then moves to an installer. A little bit like you would expect in the motor vehicle industry, where assemblers basically, when a lot of the parts are actually made by upstream manufacturers, they sell them to the assemblers, and the assemblers put the car together, and their focus is really on the end customer. So that's really what I mean at a very high level about being structurally fit, is actually basically what's the right word, upending the existing business model. Whether that can be done in practice is a completely different thing. That's the theoretical model.
Theory's always good. Thanks, Paul. I think that's a good explanation of structurally fit and what the paper's referring to. Andrew, the paper refers to a number of countries that have seemingly embraced industrialization. What's your experiences overseas? Are other countries embracing this industrialization?
Well, I mean, I keep looking. Been looking for 20 years. You know, I was in Phoenix, Arizona in 2005, and I think they built about 100,000 homes that year. Maybe 30 fell within the end point of what you'd think industrialization meant. A lot is referred to Sweden as one case. You know, one small population, pretty close to New Zealand. They do a lot of apparently modular type construction, but when you look at it, it's simply, you know, concrete blocks. I think really there's a lot more news and press about it because it feels like a fancy silver object than the reality. I think the reality is in New Zealand, Australia, Canada, United States, and the UK, that the full industrialized process is just cottage industry type stuff. And in the construction, main area of construction, the status quo, albeit it's constantly changing and updating, keeps on going. So it's always exciting when you see a company doing really well. Like there was a really good one in Australia, a panelization company, and then, you know, unfortunately something happens and they go bankrupt. So I see the light at the end of the tunnel, but the tunnel's blocked.
That's I think that's a great way to segue into Julien when we're talking about perhaps the pipeline or the process is blocked. Julien, from your perspective, how do you view industrialisation? Is this the way to go in New Zealand, and are there blockages?
Yeah, well, look, I agree with what Andrew's just said. I mean, I think it is the way to go, but I think we've got the issue, whereas other larger markets can scale up very quickly and turn on a dime. They've got large capital markets. We don't have any of those things. And if you think about it, we have very few large companies that have the ability to invest that sort of capital. But, you know, it's chicken and egg, you know, and I think about those companies in particular who have looked at projects that are in the order of $300 million plus, you know, a couple of years to build. If you are looking at industrializing and getting into modularization in a big scale, but to do that and to take the risk of doing that, you've got to have the certainty of, customers at the other end, that the market's not going to have shifted in the meantime. And that takes me back to the story of, you know, our largest building company. So we look at what happened with Fletcher Building. Fletcher's began when MJ Savage and that Labor government said to them, look, here's a contract, you go and build all of New Zealand's state houses for the next 10, 15 years. We'll give you the certainty of all of that work. That enabled that company to scale up, and that's, you know, what's led to them having the size and diversification that they've got today. So, yeah, I think we need to get away from the bespoke nature of building in New Zealand. I think we need to move to more modular prefabrication. It's starting, you know, we've got places like Clever Core that are doing this, but only on the scale of, I think they do, you know, 500 homes a year or 41 homes a month. When you think of what our capacity is to build, you know, upwards of 50,000, it's nothing. So we do need to do that, but actually to make that work, I think it's going to be much more a case of, you know, New Zealand industry and government also partnering on a much longer term approach on some of these things, because you're never going to get people investing that sort of money if there's still uncertainty and risk involved. And maybe it's, you know, about adopting new models like the alliance model, for example. So it is something that we need to do, but to Andrew's point, I think there are blockages.
I think scale, you mentioned their scale, Julien, and I do remember reading and also talking to someone in the market regarding how many houses would need to be scaled up to be able to make it profitable to follow down the industrialisation line in New Zealand. And it was in the scale of 50 within a week, and to be able to deliver them effectively by transporting them through the New Zealand infrastructure, which perhaps is a challenge. So, Paul, the paper suggests that New Zealand's lagging other countries on industrialisation, the building process. What that is the likely of that to remain the case for a long time, and why is that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing I'd like to say is I agree with both Julien and Andrew, to be honest. When we first put the paper together, we had this theoretical model and said, well, this is the way the industry would ideally go. It soon became really clear to us when we talked to the industry and lots of players in the industry that actually the chances of that happening were pretty remote. And then we said, well, why would that not be the case? Why would that be the case? And some of the issues that have been raised, issues around economies of scale and the lack of scale. Basically, we've only got a relatively small population, so the economies of scale not there. But I would say there were a couple of other things that we did look at. I suppose the key issue for the industry is whether it makes financial sense. Returns in this industry are really high. We did a comparison using the annual enterprise survey, and we looked at returns on equity and return on assets, and they're really high. So where's the incentive to change? And there isn't really. And that's not to say there won't be change. That would be wrong as well. Digitization is happening, and firms are adopting new technologies. It's whether they're they go the extra leap or the extra step and actually turn their business models on their head. So there were a couple of things. Returns on investment and equity are already high, and the investment required would be absolutely massive if you were going to reconfigure the industry. This is a small population, small market. So those are the kind of things that would preclude move into a fully industrialized kind of model. I'm sure there are others as well. I should also point out, and I think many of the issues that face the industry are really endemic. So every firm faces those. So really, if everybody's in the same boat, why change? So there is a little bit of that. But yeah, as I said, I tend to agree with both Andrew and Julien in terms of would we move to this super duper model, theoretical model? Probably not, certainly not anytime soon. But I do have a kind of interim suggestion, which we'll talk about later.
Right, sounds good, Paul. I'm going to ask just to Andrew, because Andrew, you've already given your views on industrialisation in New Zealand, but why to a greater or a lesser extent do past practices still prevail the way we build now?
It's all about risk and cost. So we're a property developer who builds homes. But to be fair, I don't really care what we build them out of or how we build them. If the market says we'll pay the revenue for those containers on your site in Westgate, and those containers on our site in Westgate cost less than our current building takeoffs, then we're doing containers. But it has never, ever transpired. A lot of false profits at the start of projects, a lot of new people, and it just never transpires that much. Just on your point about the money spent to get things up and running, legal in general, which is pretty much Fletcher Living in the UK. I just read an article from October. They had recorded a £37 million pre-tax loss last year. Totally, they've spent £174 million before they've got revenue. So, you know, that's in Britain, and that's a much bigger housing market than us. So that's sort of an interesting dilemma. Look, there is industrialisation happening, and there's very interesting things in AI. I mean, the whole process of turning building consent plans into pre-nail takeoffs. One company is using artificial intelligence now. It's taken 9 days down to half an hour. You know, drones. The amount of stuff that drones do now that used to had to be calculated, and people running over dirt piles and all that sort of stuff. So there's a lot of exciting things that are happening. We went through a process with Carter's, and it took us about 18 months to 2 years, where we developed the cassette floor system that a lot of other builders are using now. Sounds easy. It's just nailing a whole of bits of wood together for a floor. But we did it on 10 units, then we had to make refinements, do another 10 units, then make some refinements, and do another 10 units. And only a few companies in New Zealand who can really do that sort of analysis, work, rework, and get it to a situation where it's at now. So it is interesting. I'll tell you one thing that's really good, and I've just read it in what have I read it in? Oh, ITM. We don't use ITM, but anyway, ITM magazine, and it talks about the Built Ready scheme that MB have just released. So that's amazing. That means you can have your modular or panelised building system, your manufactured system, pre-consented. And when you stick down your plans to council, councils have to approve it without going into all the details. So the government are on board with that. That's a really good initiative. And that might drive product suppliers and manufacturers to sell to developers like us more of their stuff. But at the end of the day, revenue minus cost equals profit. And if that cost equation isn't down for a comparable product, then there's a problem.
Thanks, Andrew. I think that that links nicely into what Paul was saying, which was around the the cost to industrialize outweighs the benefit in the initial term. It's definitely a long-term game. But what's positive there is there are some really great things on partial industrialization with AI, with drones, and with also local councils or government coming on board and making things more efficient, cutting time down to deliver the end products. That's great to see. Julien, there are firms that build homes, and there's firms that build homes in factories. You're well familiar with Fletchers who possibly are doing that. But that's on a limited basis, and it's driven traditionally by technology. What's your view on the industrialisation and where it is at the moment?
Oh, well, again, I think it's limited, and we can do more, but it's not just about necessarily about the big stuff. Andrew's talked about drones and some of those things. And I think even introducing more technology, for example, I think Paul's paper talks about 5D modeling in BIMs. So even the process of ensuring that at the early design process, your design is such where you don't have problems down the track in the actual build, can save an enormous amount of money. And I think there are many firms that are still not using that 3 or 5D modeling. So even if we started seeing more uptake of that, I think that would make a big difference in terms of introducing greater efficiency, and also just Andrew's point about the consenting too. I think it's a significant move that has been made to rationalize that consenting process, but small changes make a difference too, and I think let's bring in much more 5D modeling.
Great. The questions are streaming through, which is fantastic on Slido. Thank you for all of those who are listening. We've got one last set of questions, and then we will move to our questions that are coming through on Slido. Paul, your paper suggests that full digitisation in the industry in New Zealand is unlikely. And that's part industrialisation is possible with, as we've already discussed, the digital technologies playing a much larger part in the building. What are those implications for our building firms?
Yeah, I mean, that's true. I mean, I think I'd echo what Julien and Andrew are saying. It's almost like a creeping industrialization of what I call, I think I referred to it in the paper as industrialization light. And that really talks about the use of digital technology. So we don't digitalize, we digitize, which is a different story. So you've seen digital technologies already being incorporated into the building process. We're likely to see much more of that as time goes on. Single-use robotics on site exoskeletons and to lift heavy loads and stuff like that. And there's much more to be had and at the moment, I'd say that it's probably been used at the margin. And yes, there will be exceptions, of course, like Andrew suggested with the artificial intelligence being used in some applications. So we'd also think that, so we do think that there is some scope for using digital technologies more and more. But we also think there is more scope for some work to be pushed up the value chain, and we think that will happen, but it will be relatively minor compared to what a full industrialization model would presume. It's a slightly changed model is what we're looking at. So how do we see the industry going forward? What do we think that the industry would look like, let's say in 10 years time? And maybe 10 years might be too soon, but certainly we see the possibility of greater assembly in factories, leveraging off digital technologies. We think that builders may actually move into assembly and actually the manufacture of structural components, and probably more installers. That doesn't mean that builders will disappear. There will still be the need for builders on site, especially for bespoke, high-end building and unique or stuff that's tailored around the customer's requirements, where the customer wants to be close. So that's the way we kind of see the building sector moving. That will take time. I mean, we regard it as being evolutionary rather than transformative. And or revolutionary, as the case may be. We also in the paper suggested the possibility, and that might have drawn some angst, of greater imports from overseas and of modular units. I realise that's been tried in the past, and there have been all kinds of issues, especially around standards. But given where digital technologies, we think that's possible, especially when you've got big factories overseas that can leverage off economies of scale. So we see the industry changing, maybe not quite as much as we would see in our theoretical industrialized building model, but certainly moving towards that point.
Great. Thanks, Paul. Andrew, you've worked in the construction sector many years. You've seen the advances. You've talked already about the digital tools being used. Partial industrialization has played a more prominent part in the construction in other countries, but you're seeing part of that come to light as well with the work that you've done in the likes of the 18 months worth of work with the flooring. Where do you see it going now with the future in New Zealand?
In the next 2 years, if how the property industry is lining up, it might not go anywhere. Look, they built the Empire State Building 1 floor a week in 1932 or whenever it was. And you can't do that nowadays. Maybe someone in China is doing that. So this is a slow-moving beast where risk is very important. It doesn't often pay to pioneer in property. So it's going to be slow going, but I think it's going to evolve in ways that we just don't think of. You know, you look at a 1960s Jetsons cartoon, everyone's in flying cars, but no one really thought about the iPhone and the internet and all that sort of stuff. So I've sort of put myself in the AI space and attended a number of bits and pieces over the last sort of year or so. And there's some interesting things that are developing in that respect, which will affect how you design and do buildings. The dream, I guess, is like, you know, Zuru, the toy guys. They want you to be able to go to a website, click a whole lot of elements, build your house. They ship them out, and I don't know, magically it gets installed on your site and fits the foundations and all the services line up. You know, so that's the potential end game. You know, it's sort of the Alibaba or the Amazon of housing. So I think it's going to evolve in ways that we're not really know how it's going to evolve. Now, the quickest way to evolve something is for the government to make it a law. So the H1 insulation standards, which I must say I think are a little bit overboard for Tauranga and Auckland, but anyway, the H1 insulation standards are making us all completely rethink windows and insulation and thermal breakaging, to the point that we're all talking to the UV PVC guys now. You know, will there be a structural change in windows from aluminium to UV PVC? So PVC windows, plastic windows, and potentially, because other countries use them. So, you know, the government could say, we're going to rebuild a Hawke's Bay and those 2,000 homes are going to be done this way, and then let that out as a big contract to a consortium of builders, and you get some sort of scale. But I just don't think New Zealand can ever get the scale that's required. You know, they can't get the scale in the UK. So I think there's exciting things that are going to pop up. I'm talking to so many young entrepreneurs who've developed prop tech and different ideas. A lot of it is a rehash of stuff that we've already seen decades ago, just stuck on a website. But some of it is new and innovative thinking. But you know, it's follow the money. It has to make financial sense. I think that will really prompts change.
Thanks, Andrew. And you talk about the government piece, and Julien, you've lobbied government in support of improving the way the sector operates in New Zealand for many, many years. And I've heard the work you're doing, which is exceptional. What are some of the key challenges facing the sector in the next 5 years? And maybe for our listeners, what are some of the 3 things that companies can do to prepare?
Well, look, 90% of our building materials are still imported, so that's still going to be an issue, and that's why we do need to have strong and tested supply chains. You know, we've learned through the last couple of years we need to know who supplies our suppliers. We can't have all our eggs in one basket. What it means is we've got to get better at procurement. We have to understand pricing. We have to start looking more at a range of alternative products. And you know, also because that you know, might mean that we actually reduce our construction cost, to Andrew's earlier point. I also think, just on this technology bent that we've been talking about, or the theme, the undercurrent is, I think automation is going to start to play a bigger part as well. There's been a massive rise over the last 2 years in commercial building of warehousing in particular. So now we're moving, we've gone past the just-in-time model. We're carrying much more inventory, but a lot of the new warehouses are all fully automated. Automation has, I think, Marty Very has his new manufacturing wood mill is fully automated. I don't think there's a single person inside that plant. The wood goes in and gets processed and comes out the other side. So I think that'll be another thing that we need to continue with. It'll kind of insulate us from any potential lack of labour or skills. I think an earlier point too that I think Paul touched on, the fact that I think businesses should be looking at perhaps diversifying or broadening their services. So rather than just being, a builder, if you can actually do the plumbing and the electrical and the gas fitting as well, put that under one umbrella, even if it means a slightly smaller, vertical approach, even if it means working in collaboration with other people. I think that would be a good thing as well, just another form of insuring yourself against shock. And I just think companies overall through this last couple of years are now just getting smarter about how they do things in a competitive market.
Thanks, Julien. I think that's some great tips just for businesses, and it's a good wrap up of our questions so far. There has been an enormous amount of questions coming through, and I really thank our listeners for hanging in there. The topic has been exceptionally received. So I just want to throw some questions across to our panel, and I'm going to start with you, Andrew. This is about the average cost per square metre to build a home. How high is it set to increase by?
Oh, look, my board, so I wonder if I've still got a job really, because we sent a board paper up started last year. I don't know, something that was at $2,500 a metre, slab up. And then 3 months later, we had to go back to them and say it's now $3,500 a metre. Now, prices did not jump by that much in 2 months, but what had happened is suppliers had held off on putting costs up on us. We had negotiated rates on deals, a year prior, and then the suppliers basically all gave up and had to pass on cost increase and everything else. So, 2022, it went up 30%. In what went to build a terraced home. Simple as that. And that's not just materials, it's labour, and it's also professional fees and all these other bits and pieces, everyone getting a pay rise and just general inflation. And holidays. Maharangi cost us 120 grand, I calculated. So 6 days are costing all our subcontractor suppliers, extra 5 days of sick days. So they're still going up. Red tape ain't getting any easier. Apparently, we're still behind the rest of the world in health and safety. So, unfortunately, that means more costs to address health and safety in the future. So it's going up. I think we've had that. I don't think the floods are going to make a massive difference to costs in Auckland. It probably completely distort Hawke's Bay, but at the moment, I think we had that 2022 bulge of costs explosion, and it built up over 2021, and all accounts is everything is reducing. Also, a lot of people got a lot less forward work. So there's a little bit of a race to the bottom, I feel, and people chasing work at the moment as well. So that's going to be interesting.
Thanks for that, Andrew. This question has come from Dave. Thanks, Dave, for putting your name to it. The recent boom saw a relatively chaotic construction industry, supply chain issues, labour shortages, consenting bottlenecks. We're all aware of all of that. Do we really have capacity in New Zealand to build 50,000 houses?
Yeah, look, I would say not. In fact, Dave raises an interesting point, because there's talk now that while we've got capacity and that number of consents, what we'll see with the slowdown and the whole cost issue, the OCR has just gone up yesterday. we're probably looking potentially at a significant drop, maybe down to 29,000 homes. So yeah, and then that's also not even talking about the labour. We still, while there's been a small increase in net migration, it's nowhere near what we need. There's a huge amount of jobs still going in building and construction.
Thanks, Julien. I'm now going to open the question up. We have covered it largely, but I'll perhaps open this one up for the panel. This has come from Peter Shane. With the recent massive flood events in the North Island, what impact is anticipated in the building sector? Huge demand for trades, of course. And is this demand likely to minimise any projected slowdown as it's expected and forecasted with the recession? Paul, can I ask you to have a stab at that one? We have really covered it already. Oh, you're on silent, Paul.
Sorry, I don't know what happened there. But anyway, yeah, we don't really see, as we mentioned earlier, basically that pipelines will be extended. We think that at a national aggregate level, actually the impacts, and when I talk about national aggregate, I'm talking about GDP, that the impact will probably be stimulatory, actually support GDP, but actually won't be that big an impact at any point in time. It will come through over time, but it's likely to be marginal. But yes, certainly it will increase the pipeline for work, and that's the issue facing the industry, is how then basically does it resource itself to tackle that work, especially when the competition is for labour is likely to intensify. I have heard reports that basically of builders struggling for labour and saying, well, half of them are going, or skilled labour is going to Australia. They're competing heavily for labour. So this seems to be an issue for the industry. So, yeah, and that, of course, is going to mean probably more inflation. Construction costs are likely to rise further, which isn't good. That by itself is inflationary, and that's not good for monetary policy.
100%. Look, this question is coming from Carol, and it's regarding humans want certainty. It's possibly more of a statement than a question, but our construction industry is very good at failing at that, and that is certainty. The average rain days in New Zealand is over 140 days. The average build time is 64 weeks. Who signs up to this? Carl says. We've got to get to the point of building more homes off-site to help alleviate that stress. So it's possibly a statement as opposed to a question, but happy for anybody wants to make a comment on that. No, we'll carry on.
I actually talked to the CEO of a company that builds homes in factories, and they would concur with what Susan is suggesting. They'd like to see more homes being built, obviously, in factories. So it is happening, but on a very limited scale.
On a limited scale.
Yeah.
This one is from Mr. and Mrs. Anonymous. Do you see the construction sector transformation accord being a good start in government industry partnering on becoming more modular, etc.? Julien, should we open with you on that?
Yeah, look, it certainly is in principle. I guess the proof's in the pudding, devil's in the detail. Yeah, but look, as I said earlier in one of my comments, I think there needs to be that ongoing collaboration between industry and government. The accord is a good start, but I think we just need to see some of that being directed to some of those things we spoke around in terms of particularly certainty and enabling people to get past risk and invest in some of the larger scale manufacturing and modularisation that we actually need.
Yep. I think, as you say, a great start in bringing that construction sector transformation accord to life. Last one, Anonymous. I know there were many questions there, but we have run out of time. But I do just want to ask this one of Andrew. What proportion of in-train new builds do you think will now fail due to the company liquidations, and how does that compare to a normal market?
Okay, normal market, property development. We're not a normal market. We're up and down like a yo-yo. Look, we had, as Westpac are aware, we had one project which we had 64 houses. We had 53 sold last year. We had 52 to settle. We'd got a few lawyers' letters saying can't settle, all that sort of stuff. In the end of those 52, 51 did settle. And then this year, the 52nd did settle, because I was really scared about settlement risk. Those projects, terrace homes and houses in Auckland, that's all I can speak to, which are settling in the next 6 months, can the people get the money from the bank to pay for them? So there's real big settlement risk out there at the moment. And so there's a lot of developers hanging on that's going to get hit. There's also builders' settlement risk of sections that they've signed up for. That's another interesting scenario. So, but once again, we've had this COVID boom. So a lot of these guys should have made some money and have some reserves, you'd hope. That's one side of it. So that might not make it as bad as it sort of sounds. The Gold Coast. There's two things in New Zealand. There's immigration and there's the Gold Coast. And the one saving grace for our construction labour market is Australia is facing the same headwinds. Australia starts booming, every tradie's going to the Gold Coast. Okay? Just that is a real risk. And we dodged that bullet because Australia's property market took a bit of a canning last year. So, yeah. And from my experience, it's not like all of a sudden people want a lot more work and prices go down. What happens is a lot of firms go under. Prices stay flat for a period of time and then start resuming, costs start going up. So, yeah, interesting times. Look, it was a rough prediction. If you drive around Auckland, you only see a third of new construction this time next year is what you're seeing now. Basically, the terrace home projects have been finished. The apartment buildings have got a long lead time. They'll be finishing end of this year, start of next year. And then it'll just be the big guys or medium guys like us and Fletchers and Classics and Gelcons who are sort of, pushing through. So we have product on the other side. That's the other key. Got to have product on the other side when the immigration, everything does resume. New Zealand Inc.'s back on its feet. But we need, it's all about people now.
Look, some incredible insights there from our panelists for all of our listeners. Luckily, this has been recorded because 57 minutes worth of a webinar is a lot to take in. So you will be able to circle back and revisit some of this information. To everyone watching, to everyone who has dialed in, thank you very much for taking the time. In particular to our panelists, Julien Leys, thank you very much. Andrew Crosby for taking the time. Paul Clark for your efforts in writing the paper. Thanks very much to each of you for joining us. As I say, the recording is going to be provided post the event in an email to everyone who has replied and joined. There is a wee survey poll there to the right of your screen. If you could please just give us some feedback on today's webinar, would be much appreciated. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a great day and keep safe.